The War of Independence, of course, took many by surprise. Although in general everyone was indifferent to patriotism and such things, many guys had serious motivation to fight. For slaves, it was primarily about freedom. Unlike American colonists, the British immediately promised freedom to all blacks if they fought on their side. Nevertheless, most blacks still fought on the side of the rebels. Let's figure out why this happened. To begin with, it's necessary to understand that not all African Americans were slaves, but almost all slaves were African Americans. Many blacks chronically hated Britain and therefore began to revolt already after the Boston Tea Party. Despite the fact that both free blacks and slaves enlisted in the Continental Army, the main bonus offered to them was freedom. And not just freedom from the possibility of being dried up and thrown to the side of life in slavery, but the rights and freedoms of a full-fledged person. Of course, all this was a blatant lie, and only naive slaves could believe in such things. But naive slaves were not so naive. In order for blacks to serve in the Continental Army, their owners freed them from slavery immediately, though not permanently. But more on that later. What can we even talk about if George Washington's adjutant, William Lee, was black, and the African-American Crispus Attucks was the first victim of the Boston Massacre? By 1780, it had gotten to the point where 1/5 of the volunteers from the northern states were black, because cannon fodder was never superfluous, although the southern states were in no hurry to arm former slaves. Both sides feared uprisings, but only the northerners did not disdain to send blacks to the meat grinder. The British also rightly feared arming slaves, as it would be nothing for the latter to raise an uprising against their masters. It all began when Lord Dunmorey issued a proclamation that freed all slaves who enlisted in the Imperial Army. He created the Ethiopian Regiment, which consisted almost entirely of runaway slaves and numbered 800 bayonets. However, already in 1776, only 250 combat-ready units remained of the regiment, which forced Dunmorey to disband this fiasco. The British deeply did not care who plugged the holes in the ranks that were formed due to irretrievable losses. Therefore, already at the end of the 1770s, blacks served in the same ranks as whites in the British Army. Let me remind you that in the USA, even during World War II, African Americans served in separate units due to segregation laws. But at the end of the 18th century, no one had heard of such a complex word yet, and almost no one felt discomfort because the ancestor of future rappers and basketball players was fighting alongside them. In the British Army, blacks were even allowed to serve in the cavalry. But as soon as 30,000 mercenaries from Hesse arrived in America, the need for former slaves disappeared by itself. The problem was also that some were returned back into slavery. But this was not the case for everyone. The same Dunmorey and General Clinton, not Bill, continued to use blacks in their armies. The most famous black loyalist was Colonel Titus Tay. He was a veteran of the Ethiopian Regiment and, after its disbandment, appointed himself colonel and gathered the remaining veterans into the Black Brigade, which fought surprisingly effectively. For example, the Black Brigade greatly assisted the British during the Siege of New York, hampering the rebels in the rear. Much of the success of the Black Brigade was due to the absence of white officers, as was the case in the Ethiopian Regiment here. Blacks commanded other blacks. In the ranking of heart-stopping fear among the rebels, the Black Brigade occupied an honorable place alongside the Queen's Rangers. Colonel Tay died from wounds received during the operation to capture one of the rebel leaders. But even after his death, the Black Brigade continued to fight on the side of the British under the leadership of Colonel Blick. By the way, in 1782, the Black Brigade was able to capture and execute the very rebel leader, Captain Huddy, who mortally wounded their first commander, Colonel Tay. The second large unit consisting of blacks was the Black Pioneers, but they mostly performed engineering work. This is a very mild name for what they actually did in real life, clearing roads, collecting garbage, burying corpses, and other worthy tasks. The Black Pioneers appeared due to General Clinton's unwillingness to allow blacks to serve with whites. But he saw no reason to refuse to use them for dirty work. For this reason, the Black Pioneers did not achieve any special military feats, but they also did not suffer such losses as the Ethiopian Regiment. After the war, which Britain lost, black loyalists turned out to be of no use to anyone, although some of them were still evacuated to Canada, where there was no slavery. Others were less fortunate. They were deported to Sierra Leone. The latter were generally ignored. The British didn't care about that. They remained in the USA and were resold into slavery. The situation of black people in the rebel ranks was little better. After Lord Dunmore's proclamation that freed the slaves, many black people began to run away from their masters. Not only did the slave owners get angry, George Washington also became furious. He was angry for two reasons. First, one of his slaves had run away to join the Ethiopian regiment, and he had to threaten the others with the wrath of God, invoking the fear of the Last Judgment and the Second Coming. Second, by luring black people to their side, the British significantly increased the number of their troops. Because of this, Washington hurried to issue a decree that allowed black people to enlist in the Continental Army. In some southern states, slave owners were allowed to send their slaves in their place. In the northern states, however, full-fledged units of black lords were created. The first of these was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Rhode Island was the least populated state and could not recruit enough volunteers to meet the quotas assigned to the state. Although the Rhode Island Regiment was not entirely composed of black soldiers, their presence earned the unit the name the Black Regiment. In its first battle, the Black Regiment suffered a crushing defeat, losing the battle for its home state. However, the Rhode Island Regiment did provide some assistance to the rebels during the Siege of Yorktown and the decisive Battle of the War of Independence. After the war, white veterans of the regiment received 100 acres of land and a small pension. In contrast, black veterans received 100 bags of dusty air and the privilege of receiving bonus beatings if they dared to make any complaints. Only 10 years later were 13 black veterans able to secure compensation through the courts. Meanwhile, African Americans who had served in the militia of the southern states were simply returned to their masters.